Luke 9:28-36. It came to pass about 8 days after, including the day on which the discourse, recorded in the preceding chapter, was delivered, and that on which the fact, here mentioned, took place. Otherwise, exclusively of these 2 days, it was 6 days after, as Matthew has it. See the following account of our Lord's transfiguration, explained at large in the notes on Matthew 17:1-8, with some additional observations on Mark 9:2-10. Moses and Elias, who appeared in glory like Christ, with whom they talked. They saw his glory, the very same expression in which it is described by John 1:14, and by Peter, 2 Peter 1:16-17. After 6 days, reckoning exclusively from that in which the discourse recorded in the preceding chapter was delivered, to that on which the transfiguration took place, or, including those 2 days, about 8 days after, as Luke has it, Jesus taketh Peter, James, and John his brother, the 3 disciples whom he honored with a peculiar intimacy, see Mark 5:37, and Matthew 26:37, and bringeth them up into a high mountain apart from the people and his other disciples. Jerome tells us, that there was a tradition in his days, handed down from the times of the apostles, that this was Mount Tabor, famed in ancient history for the victory which Deborah and Barak gained over Sisera, Judge 4:14. Dr. McKnight, however, thinks the order of the history determines the transfiguration to some mountain not far from Caesarea Philippi, rather than to Tabor, which was situated in the south of Galilee. For after the transfiguration, it is said, Mark 9:30, that they departed and passed through Galilee, and then came to Capernaum. Now it is not very probable that the evangelist would in this manner have narrated our Lord's journey from the Mount of Transfiguration to Capernaum, if that mountain had been in Galilee, the region in which Capernaum stood. Yet upon the faith of the tradition mentioned above, the Christians very early built a monastery and church on the top of Tabor, which church was dedicated to Jesus and his 2 attendants, Moses and Elias. And from 2 Peter 1:18, they called the mountain itself, the Holy Mountain. And he was transfigured before them, namely, before these 3 disciples. It was necessary that so remarkable an occurrence should be supported by sufficient witnesses, and hence it was that the 3 above mentioned were chosen, because so many were required among the Jews to establish a fact, and no more were chosen, because this number was sufficient. The word mu epsilon tau epsilon mu omicron rho phi omega theta, rendered here, transfigured, may either imply that there was a transformation made in the substance of his body, according to the import of the word in Ovid, and other writers, or that the outward appearance only of his body was altered, which seems most probable from the expression used by Luke, who says, tau omicron epsilon iota delta omicron tau omicron upsilon pi rho omicron sigma omega pi omicron upsilon alpha upsilon tau omicron upsilon epsilon rho omicron nu. The appearance of his countenance, or person, was changed, and this change, according to that evangelist, took place while he was praying, chap. Matthew 9:29. And his face did shine as the sun, became radiant and dazzling, and shone like the sun in its unclouded, meridian clearness, and so was incomparably more glorious than the face of Moses at the giving of the law. And his raiment was white as the light became, says Mark, shining exceeding white, as snow, so as no fuller on earth could white it. Was white and glistering, says Luke, or white as lightning, as lambda epsilon upsilon kappa omicron epsilon xi alpha sigma tau rho alpha pi tau omega nu properly signifies. It seems it was bright and sweetly refulgent, but in a degree inferior to the radiancy of his countenance. The indwelling deity, says Mr. Wesley, darted out its rays through the veil of his flesh, and that with such transcendent splendor, that he no longer bore the form of a servant. His face shone with divine majesty, like the sun in its strength, and all his body was so irradiated by it, that his clothes could not conceal his glory, but became white and glistering as the very light, with which he covered himself as with a garment. And behold, to heighten the grandeur and solemnity of the scene, there appeared unto them, that is, unto the disciples as well as Jesus, Moses and Elias. Luke says, 2 men, which were Moses and Elias, and Mark, Elias with Moses. Moses, the great lawgiver of the Jews, and Elijah, who had been a most zealous restorer and defender of the law, appeared in the glories of immortality, wherewith the blessed above are adorned, talking with him, and, according to Luke, the subject of their conversation was, the decease which he should accomplish at Jerusalem, that is, his departure out of the present life, or the sufferings and death whereby he was to atone for sin, and effect the redemption of mankind, a subject the most important of all others, and therefore the most proper to employ the thoughts and tongues of these illustrious personages, the most illustrious, certainly, that had ever met together on earth in one place. But the 3 disciples were seized with an irresistible drowsiness, and fell into a deep sleep. They awoke, however, time enough to see Christ's glory, and that of the 2 men who stood with him. Probably the streams of light which issued from Christ's body, especially his countenance, and the voices of Moses and Elias talking with him, made such an impression on their senses as to awake them. Lifting up their eyes, therefore, they must have been amazed beyond measure when they beheld their Master in the majesty of his transfigured state, and his illustrious attendants, whom they might know to be Moses and Elias by revelation, or by what they said, or by the appellations which Jesus gave them in speaking to them. Peter, particularly, being both afraid and glad at the glorious sight, was in the utmost confusion. Nevertheless, the forwardness of his disposition prompted him to say something, and just as Moses and Elias were departing from Jesus, he said, "Lord, it is good for us to be here." So doubtless they found it. Both before and after this transfiguration they had many refreshing seasons with their Master, heard many ravishing sermons, and saw many wonderful miracles, yet in no place, and on no occasion but this, were they ever heard to say, "It is good for us to be here." Peter fancied, doubtless, that Jesus had now assumed his proper dignity, that Elias was come, according to Malachi's prediction, and that the kingdom was at length begun. Wherefore, in the first hurry of his thoughts, he proposed to provide some accommodation for Jesus and his august attendants, intending, perhaps, to bring the rest of the disciples, with the multitude, from the plain below, to behold his matchless glory. He thought this was better for his Master than to be killed at Jerusalem. He said, "Therefore, if thou wilt, let us make here 3 tabernacles." He says, 3, not 6, because the apostles desired to be with their Master. They were words of rapturous surprise, and, as Mark observes, very improper. But, perhaps, few in such an astonishing circumstance could have been perfectly masters of themselves. While he yet spake, behold, a bright cloud overshadowed them, such, probably, as took possession first of the tabernacle, and afterward of Solomon's temple, when those holy places were consecrated. See Exodus 40:34, 1 Kings 8:10-11, where we are told that the cloud filled the house of the Lord, so that the priests could not stand to minister, because of the cloud, for the glory of the Lord had filled the house of the Lord. This, it is well known, used to be termed the Shekinah, or visible symbol of the divine presence. A similar cloud, it seems, now overshadowed Jesus and his 2 glorified attendants, and therefore is termed by Peter, 2 Peter 1:17, the excellent glory. And behold, a voice out of the cloud, namely, the voice of God himself, "This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased." The same testimony which the Father bore to Jesus at his baptism, as recorded Matthew 3:17, where see the note. Thus, for the full confirmation of the disciples' faith in Jesus, Moses, the giver of the law, Elijah, the most zealous of all the prophets, and God speaking from heaven, all bore witness to him. Hear ye him as superior even to Moses and the prophets. This command of the Father plainly alluded to Deuteronomy 18:15, and signified that Jesus was the prophet of whom Moses spake in that passage, and concerning whom he enjoined, "Unto him shall ye hearken." Luke informs us that the 3 disciples feared as they, namely, as Moses and Elias, entered into the cloud, but now, at the very moment when they heard the voice coming from the cloud, probably as loud as thunder, see John 12:29, and full of divine majesty, such as mortal ears were unaccustomed to hear, they fell flat to the ground on their faces, being sore afraid, an effect which visions of this kind commonly had on the prophets and other holy men to whom they were given. See Genesis 15:12, Isaiah 6:5, Ezekiel 2:1, Daniel 10:8, Revelation 1:17. It seems human nature could not of itself support such manifestations of the divine presence. In this condition the 3 disciples continued till Jesus came and touched them, and, raising them up, dispelled their fears. And when they had lifted up their eyes, Mark says, when they had looked round about, they saw no man any more, says Mark, save Jesus only with themselves. In Luke we read, when the voice was past, Jesus was found alone. This transfiguration of our Lord was doubtless intended for the following, among several other very important purposes. First, to prevent his disciples from being offended at the depth of affliction into which they were soon to see him plunged. For their beholding him clothed with such glory would tend to establish them in the belief of his being the Messiah, notwithstanding the sufferings which he was to pass through, and the conference which he had with Moses and Elias concerning those sufferings, and the death in which they were to terminate, might make them sensible how agreeable it was to the doctrine of Moses and the prophets that the Messiah should be evil entreated and die before he entered into his glory. 2d. To arm them for, and encourage them under, their own sufferings, by a demonstration of a future state, and a display of the felicity of that state. Here they see Moses, who had died in the land of Moab, and was buried in a valley in that land. Deuteronomy 34:5, alive in a state of glory. This then was a demonstration to them of the immortality of the soul, for Moses, it is certain, had not been raised from the dead with regard to his body, Christ being the first fruits from the grave, or the first whose body rose to immortal life, as is evident from 1 Corinthians 15:20, 1 Corinthians 15:23, Acts 26:23, Colossians 1:18, Revelation 1:5. Here they also see Elijah, who indeed had not died, but had been translated, that is, as the apostle expresses it, had not been unclothed of the body, but clothed upon with an immortal body, or whose mortality had been swallowed up of life, 2 Corinthians 5:4. He was therefore in that state of glory in which the saints will be after the resurrection and the general judgment. The disciples, therefore, had thus full proof, even of a twofold state of future felicity awaiting the righteous, first, in their souls, immediately after death, and secondly, in both their bodies and souls after the resurrection. And it is remarkable that St. Paul particularly distinguishes these states, 2 Corinthians 12:2-4, speaking of being caught up both unto paradise, the state and place of holy souls after death, and also into the third heaven, the state and place of the faithful after the resurrection. This discovery, made to the disciples, was of great importance, and very necessary in those times when the opinions of the Sadducees were so prevalent, and it appears from all the epistles in the New Testament, that the apostles derived great support under their sufferings from the prospect of the future glory that awaited them, in their hopes of which this vision must have greatly confirmed them. 3d. To show them the superiority of Christ as a teacher, lawgiver, and mediator, to Moses and Elias, who, though both eminent in their stations, were only servants, whereas this was God's beloved Son, and, of consequence, that he was to be preferred to all that had preceded him, whether patriarchs or prophets, and therefore that the gospel was more excellent than the law, the Christian than the Jewish dispensation. For when Moses and Elias, representing the law and the prophets, were present, the Father from heaven commanded that his Son should be heard in preference to them. Fourth, that the preceding dispensations of the law and the prophets were in perfect harmony with Christ and his dispensation, were introductory thereto, and to terminate therein, for when Moses and Elias had disappeared, Jesus remained as the sole teacher of his disciples, and of consequence of his church and people.